Um, okay, so I'm going to talk today about cybersecurity issues. This is a almost too sexy a title for the talk, because I know what you're thinking. You're saying, I know who's watching me. But I'm not going to talk about that. I'm going to talk about cyber espionage instead, and then at the end, if you want, since I did work as the General Counsel of the National Security Agency, I'm happy to talk about some of those issues as well toward the end of the talk. But what I wanted to start with was the nature of the cyber espionage problem and how serious it is. And I've put up there the logos of companies that are in the security business. RSA makes those little dongles that many of us use to log on. Bit9 makes a product which guarantees that only products approved by your IT department are running on the network. HB Gary investigated security incidents. DigiNotar issued digital certificates, credentials to a whole bunch of government agencies so that they could have secure online commerce. DISA is in charge of the SIPRNet, the secure internet that the US government runs. Every one of them understood that security was job one. Every one of them understood that they were likely to be attacked. And every one of them failed to prevent a successful attack that took down their raison d'etre as a business. Each of them suffered major compromises. DigiNotar is out of business. HB Gary lost its CEO because of the embarrassment of their emails being disclosed. And RSA and Bit9 have suffered significant business hits. So what this tells us is there's nobody who knows how to secure their networks with any certainty today. And that's the problem that Washington has been struggling with for the last, really, since the Clinton administration. Government has been talking about this problem, but only recently, partly because private companies have begun disclosing what they know about attacks on networks. Only recently has it become obvious to everybody that the Chinese government and a number of other governments are breaking into networks on a massive scale, stealing pretty much everything that they want from those networks, and then taking it back to benefit their country or their industry. And so the government, now that everybody recognizes it, there's more willingness to try to do something about it, although exactly what will be done about it is not so clear. I'll talk about what the government's defensive strategy is first. There has been probably a pretty consistent effort to pass cybersecurity legislation for the last couple of years, and during the election, it finally came to a head in 2012, and this an election year, presidential election year, is a bad time to try to pass serious legislation. That legislation ran into significant partisan problems. It didn't start out as partisan, but the temptation to make it partisan, to say I oppose this because I hate that guy in the White House, or the idiot who's running for the White House has got it wrong. That temptation became overwhelming, and it broke largely on party lines. And I think, frankly, we'll talk a little bit about it, but I suspect we're not going to see legislation this year either, maybe not next year. So the president has, once the election campaign was behind him, decided to say, why don't I do everything I can with my existing authority to encourage critical industry infrastructure to adopt higher security. And so he came up with a executive order in February of this year. The executive order basically organizes the government's approach to cybersecurity in the private sector. And it starts by saying, what kind of incentives can we give industry, especially people who have critical infrastructure? How can we incentivize them to adopt higher security standards? And in June, that's to say this month, the president is supposed to get a report from 3 different agencies about their view about the kinds of incentives that would improve cybersecurity in the private sector. I had a friend who was a negotiator for the British government who did a lot of negotiations with the United States. And he used to say, you know, I can always tell when the US government knows what it wants because they send one negotiator and he asks for what he wants. Even if they send 3 or 4 different negotiators, even if one of them does all the talking, I know that the US government doesn't yet really know what it wants and that there's a fight going on and that the guy who's talking has brought those other people so they can watch him and disagree with him in private. And, you know, as I'm negotiating, I need to figure out which of those guys might be an ally. This is the same thing. When the president asked the Treasury Department, the Commerce Department, and DHS all to give him a list of incentives that they think will work on private industry, you know that each of those agencies has already been fighting in front of the president to discredit the other ideas. And so the Commerce Department is saying, oh, just give him money, or give him something soft and cuddly. And the Department of Homeland Security is saying, no, we need to be tougher about this. We need to actually make sure that they meet high standards. And the Treasury Department is saying, well, do whatever you want, just don't touch the banks. So that's probably what he's getting this month. In July, the Department of Homeland Security is going to identify the critical infrastructure that has to be secured. I've called this, for those of you who know something about Yale, the skull and bones method. It's all confidential, but somebody comes up and taps you on the shoulder and says, you're going to be critical. That is the decision. That's how you know you're in the critical infrastructure. Most people, most industries have said, you know, I'd just as soon not, because they fear it will bring added attention, added regulatory burdens, and the like. And that may well be true. I think some of those industries are kidding themselves because, as we'll see, I think they're critical because if they fail, it's a disaster for their customers and maybe for society at large. And you know, if your failures cause a disaster for your customers and society at large, liability tends to follow. My guess is you're better off engaging with the government and getting the government to say, you know, you're doing the right thing. That's great. That's all we ask of you. But we'll see. In any event, there'll be a process of designating those folks, and people have an opportunity to argue about that if they are designated, and if they feel that being part of critical infrastructure is not something that they want to do. Then in October, NIST, which is part of the Commerce Department, will come up with a set of security standards, a framework for security that they think can be applied to critical infrastructure and perhaps other companies that care about security. So that process is designed to produce first a draft in October, and then, as we'll see, by the beginning of next year, I think February, they'll promulgate a final set of standards. I'll talk a little bit about what those standards are likely to look like. And then finally, interestingly, in January, there is an effort to talk about regulatory capability. And this is odd because, of course, the president didn't get any legislation giving him new regulatory authority. So what he's doing is turning to all the regulatory agencies, from NERC to the FCC to the FTC, and saying to them, you already have authority to regulate some portion of U.S. industry. And in many cases, the overlap between regulatory authority and critical infrastructure is pretty substantial, and that's not surprising. Many of these industries are things that were considered utilities. It was too easy to price gouge because people had to have them. Well, if it's something people have to have, then when you lose it, it's very bad for the body politic, and that makes you critical. So there is a substantial overlap between existing regulatory authority and critical infrastructure. So the president is going to be asking each of those regulatory agencies to look at that draft promulgated standard that NIST came up with in October, and in January they're to report back to him to say, what can we do with our existing authority to get people to adopt that framework? So if you're thinking about this from the point of view of regulated industry, you should be following that framework reasonably closely and asking yourself, can we live with that? Is it likely to be imposed on us by our regulators? And do they really have the authority to do that? If they decide they don't have the authority to do that, I wouldn't be surprised to see the president come up with some legislative proposals, but that'll be dicey, I think, as he gets deeper into his second term. So that is very broadly what the timeline is for the executive order. I want to talk a little bit about the incentives and then the standards and then a few other regulatory issues that arise. We already actually know what incentives people are going to come up with. And the Commerce Department is going to say, how about tax credits? How about we just rely on insurance, the insurance industry to tell people what they need to do to get a discount off of their insurance because they're doing a good job. And I've said to people that I think you really have to believe in the tooth fairy to think that that's what we're going to get. Because there are, nobody's given up tax credits because we have too big a deficit. And the insurance industry, the insurance industry can only sell you insurance if you're afraid you're going to have a loss that's bigger than the premiums. And the only way you're likely to have a loss in this area is if you're held liable. And so at the end of the day, if industry doesn't believe it's going to be held liable, it's not going to go out and spend a boatload of money for insurance. And in any event, the insurance industry doesn't have a good idea, doesn't have enough history with claims to be able to tell you what is good practice that they want you to adopt and that will earn you a discount on your insurance. So I'm kind of skeptical about that, but that's clearly going to be part of the discussion. Procurement. The US government does buy a lot of stuff, and if it says we're only going to buy stuff from people who have good security practices, that will have an impact. Exactly how that works is not so clear. The US government's impact through procurement on the economy and on the design of IT and the like is dwindling away pretty fast. It's nothing like what it was in the 50s and the 60s. But if you're representing a power company and you sell power to Fort Huachuca, I wouldn't be surprised if the Defense Department comes back and says, by the way, we've got a new clause in our contract that requires you to have done something to make sure that the power stays on in a cyber attack. So we'll see something that goes beyond just a focus on procurement of IT by traditional military suppliers. But I'm not sure how much it's going to go beyond some big obvious procurements such as power. Another area, and now we're slowly getting more prescriptive, codes of conduct. This is a notion, DHS loves this stuff. DHS is a kind of, I think it was, there's a famous Chicago professor who wrote a book called Nudge Regulation. The notion being that you don't actually have to tell people what you do, you just kind of nudge them in the right direction. You put calories up on the fast food restaurant meals so they know how much they're eating and the like, and that'll produce changes of behavior. This is sort of that. The notion is that that 60 to 80% of industry probably does the right thing, and that they've got the bottom 20% is the biggest problem. And so in areas such as the security of chemical facilities, DHS has gone out and said, we want you all, you respectable chemical facilities owners, to come up with a list of security measures that you think are responsible. And then we will go out and harry the laggards to get them to join and do the same kind of thing. And that is a common, DHS has never been an enthusiastic regulator. They didn't exist before, they came in long after the Reagan Revolution in regulatory affairs. They were created by a Republican administration, and so the idea of command and control regulations never really took off with DHS. And so the idea of coming up with codes of conduct that reflect industry practice among the industry leaders and then pushing everybody else to catch up with those leaders is an idea that DHS is very fond of. And of course, you can enforce that by the way the FTC does, of sort of encouraging people to state what their standards are, forcing them to adopt reasonably good standards in theory, and then when they fail to live up to those, or to your new, tougher interpretation of what they said, you sue them, as the FTC has sued most of the internet giants on privacy. So that is it turns out, you think you're not in a regulatory regime until somebody from the state attorney general or the FTC sues you and says you didn't know it, but you've already signed up to this regulatory regime. And I think that's not unlikely, in part because for those of you who practice tort law, you know that if the government has adopted a standard and industry has signed up to a standard and you don't meet it, and because of your failure to meet it, somebody suffers harm, they're going to sue you for negligence, and they're going to have a prima facie case that you were negligent because you ignored the industry standard. And so, without ever passing any law making people liable for bad security, I think the president's executive order probably creates a significant quasi-regulatory set of requirements for industry. And then last on this topic, the SEC, one of the ways that, again, people who want to regulate but don't have the self-confidence just to say, I like regulation and I'm going to impose it, which is a lot of politicians. They want to sneak up on it. And one way to do it is try to embarrass industry into doing more. And so the idea, and the SEC and its disclosure policy has turned out to be a way to embarrass industry into everything from foreign corrupt practices to Y2K compliance. And the way this works is the SEC says, we think that if you're not doing this, it reflects on how good a business you are. Your investors need to know whether you're really doing a good job on topic A, topic B, topic C. So you need to disclose how good a job you're doing on that. People start disclosing. They don't like it when they have to disclose that they aren't doing a good job. They feel embarrassed. Maybe they get derivative suits because it affects their stock price, or the SEC brings an enforcement action for failure to disclose just how bad a job they've done. And so people start disclosing, and in the process say, God, I can't disclose this. We got to do a better job. So again, it's nudge regulation of a sort. And the Commerce Committees and the SEC and the administration have been enthusiastic about this, and they have been slowly tightening the screws through guidance, and I wouldn't be surprised to see more formal guidance coming out of the commission itself, not just the staff, that says you need to disclose. I think today there's a pretty good argument that if you have an ongoing intrusion in your network, you need to disclose that fact. there are probably two kinds of companies: those who know they have an ongoing intrusion, and those who don't know that they have an ongoing intrusion. And we'll talk a little bit about that later. But there are a lot of people who need to be disclosing if that interpretation is right. Most people are not disclosing at that level of detail. They're simply saying, in general, yes, it's a big problem, and we can't be sure we can keep people out. And I understand the SEC justification for making a kind of vague disclosure like that. It may be sufficient for materiality purposes. But the politicians would like to see more, and I wouldn't be surprised to see Mary Jo White from the SEC impose more. And then finally, incentives to do this that certainly require legislation. The president has said, I will support a national breach notification law that preempts all the state laws that currently, there's more than 50 laws requiring that you disclose breaches depending on all of the territories in the District of Columbia. So when you have a breach, you have to notify essentially everybody, and increasingly the Europeans have this as well. Those laws, it's still possible in theory to comply with all of them, but it's getting harder and harder as they slowly diverge off in different directions based on the enthusiasms of particular state legislatures. That has led to a substantial interest in having a single standard so that people can actually apply one standard to the United States. And there are some advantages to the US in doing that. That will clearly require a new piece of legislation. I have to say, just briefly, for people who believe the Obama administration has brought all of the liberal interest groups to Washington and given them more or less what they wanted, the one interest group that is a traditional part of the Democratic Party that is not getting much from this administration is the trial lawyers. I don't think the president is especially enthusiastic about the trial lawyers bar. And his willingness to endorse preemptive legislation on this topic is an indication that the folks who believe in more liability for corporate America are actually in a little bit of a hole with this administration and with Congress. And then finally, same thing, liability safe harbor, an assurance that if you do all the things that we have told you to do in our security framework, then we'll protect you when the trial bar comes looking for you after an incident. And again, this would have been, I frankly think, unthinkable in the Clinton administration, but it is an idea that the administration has been willing to toy with. There is something called the Safety Act that the Department of Homeland Security already administers that is designed to say if you have anti-terrorism technology that works pretty well but not perfectly, bring it in, show us how it works. If we decide it's an advance over what most people are doing today, we will give you Safety Act protection, which means you go out and buy insurance and your liability is limited by the insurance that you buy, even if the product, it saves a bunch of lives, but not all of them, for example, which would be typical for a lot of terrorism technology. There's an idea which is popular among both Republicans and Democrats on the Hill and inside the administration that maybe the Safety Act and that approach could be adapted for cybersecurity products. And it's worth thinking seriously about that. We may see some action inside the administration or on the Hill in that regard. The standards, I won't spend too much time on this. The National Institute for Standards and Technology has already acknowledged they're not going to be able to write a new standard. All they're going to do is find standards. The old joke, the nice thing about standards is there's so many to choose from. That's what they're doing. They're choosing from among a bunch of standards. They're going to come up with something, but exactly what, and maybe they'll find a few areas where some additional work would be useful, but that's probably all they can do. This is, by government lights, this is a remarkably aggressive schedule to get that done by October. And then regulation, I told you that the President wants reports from regulatory agencies about what they can do to improve security standards in critical infrastructure. And there's a lot of, surprisingly, a large amount of existing regulatory authority that, for those of you who are lawyers or in industry, it's worth keeping in mind. And there's a sort of Venn diagram of those authorities that I've put up there. On the one hand, you've got privacy authorities, which are about protecting people's personally identifiable information. And that's, we think of that as privacy and keeping Facebook under control and the like, or the Direct Marketing Association. But in fact, it turns out that 90% of what you really, of the places where you actually get bite out of these privacy rules are in the context of how good was your security. Did you protect people from having their password hashes stolen from your system? So the FTC and the FCC, less clearly, but to some degree, already have authority to regulate people's security with respect to personally identifiable information. The same is true for HHS under HIPAA and the HITECH Act. They have way over-regulated, in my view, because actually nobody really wants your health data, but they are determined and enthusiastic about imposing massive security costs on the health industry. And then, of course, we talked about the state breach notification laws. Every time somebody loses a laptop in the airport, if it's not encrypted, then all the information that's on that laptop is presumed to have been seized by identity thieves who are going to be using it to invade the privacy of all the individuals whose names and account data you had on there. And that means you have to notify them and then deal with the lawsuit, the class action lawsuit that follows. So every lost laptop costs the company between $5 and $10 million. Unless they encrypted the hard drive, which is why so much of our security budget these days is going to encrypting laptop hard drives, which is not where the biggest problem is. Most of those computers are just resold. Maybe they're reformatted, and nobody's using that data. But because of the way the laws are written, you can't say that. So you have to disclose and live with the lawsuit. So there's already a fair amount of security regulation. It's a little distorting because it pushes people in the wrong direction for security, but it could be used to push people in a more appropriate direction, worrying about more sophisticated thieves. There's also some security regulations that actually focuses just on making sure that particular infrastructure is secure. And the most obvious ones are the defense industry and the power industry. The defense industry, because they are a target for every government that would like to take a shortcut in designing its weapons or in fighting the United States. And the Defense Department has begun coming up with a series of regulations, including a regulation that says, you know that breach notification stuff, if there's a compromise of personally identifiable information? Well, our proposal is you just notify us every time you have a successful penetration. Don't worry about whether it's personally identifiable information. We figure that we know what they're after, and we just want to know if they got into your system. FERC and NERC have taken a reliability law and turned it into a security law, not very successfully in my view, but they've worked to do that, and it's very clear that what they are writing is security rules that are designed to make sure that the power doesn't get cut off by a cyber attack, which is all too easy to do, as we'll cover in a second. The problem is, and this is a problem that is, it's not that the folks who run power companies are evil. They have incentives, and the incentive, we all know, especially if you live in Phoenix and you stay through August, that power cannot go off. You absolutely cannot let it go off. It goes off for 2 days. People grumble pretty seriously. Stays off for a week, and your CEO's out of a job. And if power goes out, you want one of 100 people to be able to go to the various substations and log on and fix whatever needs to be fixed. Well, if you have to have 100 people who can log on to the same computer, you are not changing the default. And so the toughest security measure in these FERC and NERC rules is you have to have a 6-character password for your equipment. Unless you have a good technical reason that you shouldn't have to do that. And there are like thousands of applications for giving good technical reasons why a 6-character password is too hard, even the default. And it's driven by people who say, I cannot let the power fail. And yes, I know in theory the Chinese are going to come turn it off, but you know, it could go off for another reason, and I can't afford to leave people unable to get in and fix it. So there is the place where we have the greatest vulnerability has a vulnerability that is largely unfixable using the tools that we've developed up to now for security. And then in the middle of this Venn diagram, there is the financial industry regulation, which is originally thought of as privacy regulation, but because what we really care about there is that people not steal our money, it is also about security. And I put up a picture of the Golden Gate Bridge because this is the kind of security measure that at the end of the day Gramm-Leach-Bliley requires. Everybody knows how you paint the Golden Gate Bridge. You start at one end and you paint and you paint and you paint until you get to the other end, and then you go back because the part you painted now needs painting again, and you just start again. So you're always painting the Golden Gate Bridge. Well, the theory of Gramm-Leach-Bliley is you should do an assessment of your security needs. You should come up with a strategy for addressing those. You should implement that strategy. You should assess how you did to see what your new security needs are. You should come up with a strategy for dealing with those. You should implement that strategy. And you should, it's, you know, lather, rinse, repeat. And that kind of procedural approach, actually I suspect, but I don't know this, I haven't talked to the NIST folks about this, I suspect at the end of the day we're going to see something like that out of NIST for the framework, because anything else is either too specific or doesn't have any bite to it. So that works if people actually care. Doesn't work at all if people just say, so I have to have a assessment and a strategy and an implementation, but you don't care what's in it? Fine, I can do that. And so if people just treat this as a compliance as opposed to a security requirement, I'm not sure how well it's going to work, but it may be the best that we can come up with. So that's, let me talk about legislation quickly. Legislation doesn't pass in Washington, you've probably all noticed that. But a couple of things, we finally have decided, both parties have decided that yes, you really do need to pass appropriations bills, and so appropriations bills are passing in some form. And so is the defense authorization bill each year. Those are two things that people have agreed have to pass. And that means we're starting to see legislative mandates get stuck into those two bills that deal with this problem. And on the defense side, I think I talked about how they require notice of intrusions. They're also asking for counterfeit parts plans and a variety of other reporting requirements. In addition, Frank Wolf, who is a subcommittee chairman in the House Appropriations Committee and who has a long history of concern about China, has successfully inserted in this year's appropriations bill something that says the certain government agencies that are under his control or under his watch may not buy IT systems that are manufactured by companies that are influenced by China. Which means owned by, subsidized by, and the like. And this is a way of addressing the problem that we've seen with Huawei and with a few other companies where people just don't trust the technology. This is a very controversial provision. It did get in. The administration, after signing the bill, said, oh, but we don't like it. And so we will see a fight over this in future years, both an effort to take it out, where industry and the administration say that it's too hard to administer, and an effort to expand it on Frank Wolf's part, who will say, tell us how you solved the problem without this, and if you haven't, then I think we ought to adopt it. So we'll continue to see some procurement issues directly related to China. CISPA, this is the information sharing bill. You've probably heard CISPA more as an epithet than as a descriptor. It is an information sharing bill that allows the government to get volunteered information from the private sector about malware. To my mind, it's a mildly good thing, but it's become an internet cause celeb where privacy advocates have trashed it as the second coming of Big Brother. Oh, sorry, no, now it's NSA is the second coming of Big Brother, but so this must be the third. Anyway, I think the NSA fight will make it unlikely that CISPA passes, but it did pass the House over a presidential veto threat, and so there may be some effort to move it through the Senate in some form. So we'll see something there. If you're from industry, the thing I would worry about is that the Senate has been interested in appeasing the privacy groups by saying, well, why don't we regulate not just what the government does with the information that's shared, but what the private sector does with the information that's shared. Right now, you can get information about malware and bad IP addresses and bad email addresses from anybody, and there's no restriction on using them to protect yourself. If the Senate version of this goes through, you could actually have to call your lawyer before you use that information, which I don't think is, I love having people call their lawyer, but glad to hear from you. But it's not good for security. So I'm hoping that that doesn't happen, and I suspect that the Chamber of Commerce will oppose that if it does get into the bill. And then what to do with critical infrastructure. As you know, as I said, they're going to identify they're going to designate the critical infrastructure, and then they're going to find out whether they can regulate the industry under existing authorities. If they can't, I wouldn't be surprised to see the president ask for additional regulatory authority, dead on arrival in the House of Representatives, and therefore I think not something you need to worry about now. Last point, just the limits of this. This whole exercise is designed to improve our defenses against cyber espionage. But none of it is going to make people better at doing security than RSA was, or Bit9, or DigiNotar, all of whom didn't succeed. And I have said that trying to regulate defense here as the sole response to cyber espionage is like trying to solve the street crime problem by requiring that people buy better body armor every year as muggers develop new technologies. It's not sufficient. And so now I'm going to turn to what I think is a really promising, I do have some good news here, really, and that is what I've called the attribution revolution, something that allows us to actually begin to figure out who's attacking us and to draw a whole bunch of consequences from that. So first, I'll talk a little bit about why that matters. What you've got up here, this is the geeky part of it. If this wasn't geeky enough, this is the geeky part of the presentation. That is an MRI of a guy whose reward center is firing. And I'll explain the circumstances. They bring the guy in, they put him in the MRI, and they say, congratulations for doing this experiment. We're going to give you $200. But there's a catch. We're going to take $100 away from you. We're going to match it 3 for 1. We're going to take $400 next door. There's another guy sitting in that room. You've never seen him. You don't know who he is. You'll never see him in your life. We're going to tell him where the $400 came from, that it came from your 100 matched by our 300. And we're going to give it to him and tell him that he can send back to you whatever he thinks is fair. And many times people will send back 200, or they'll say, well, I ought to at least give him back his 100, the seed money. and sometimes they think, you know, nothing's fair. So that doesn't actually fire anybody's reward center. But when they tell them, no, he thought nothing was fair for you, they say, but we have a second 3-for-1 deal. Every dollar you give us, we'll take 4 away from that son of a bitch. And this is the reward center firing as the guy in the MRI hands over his last $100 and says, take it all. And, you know, actually, I didn't have to go through that, right? You've driven in Phoenix traffic. There are people who cheerfully suffer harm to enforce their view of what the rules ought to be. Which, okay, so we all know that happens. But this is a real puzzle for Darwin, right? How is it that you go out and suffer harm for some abstract principle that won't help you? Hurting that guy is not going to ever help the guy in the MRI. He just did it because, by God, you know, you don't screw with me. And I called the guy up and I said, so, you know, that did the study. I said, isn't this a problem for Darwin? The only way I can think of that this actually has adaptive value is if Homo sapiens as a species is better off because we have these self-righteous jerks who enforce rules at harm to themselves. And he said, yeah, I think that's it. You know, social order is part of our success as a species. Maintaining the rules, enforcing the rules, even at cost to the individual who serves as the enforcer, makes the group more successful, makes it more likely to succeed than lone hominids out on the prairie. Okay, end of a geeky interruption, except to say, what this says is, as a species, our success has depended on finding people who are breaking the rules and punishing them. You know, this was not about a better defense. This was about saying, no, you don't do that to me. And building an infrastructure where people can impose massive costs on everybody else without suffering consequences, without running into the guy in the MRI, is a social experiment that goes against hundreds of thousands of years of evolution, because you don't get reward centers in your brain without a lot of evolution contributing to that. So we really need to find ways to identify the people who are attacking us and bring a certain amount of justice, rough justice, to their activities. Now, the first question that always arises from the privacy guys, for whom I have limited sympathy, as you probably can tell, is, well, but what, anonymity is such a great thing. Everybody loves anonymity. The Supreme Court says it was part of the Constitution, you know, and the Founding Fathers all wrote under pseudonyms. Isn't anonymity really essential? It's an important part of our body politic. And I think I wouldn't listen to the Supreme Court on this, and I wouldn't listen to the Founding Fathers. I would listen to Hollywood, because they really understand how we feel about certain things, far out as they can be. On this issue, they know what we think of people who are anonymous, because in Hollywood, the guy in the mask is almost always the bad guy. You know, it doesn't take much to come to the conclusion that we may like wearing the mask ourselves, but we do not want to live in a society where these guys are on every street corner. So, the good news now. The good news is, I should have said earlier, I'm going to give you kind of a Huffington Post view of cybersecurity, which is fair amount of facts, fair amount of opinion, a little bit of cleavage. The good news about the where we are going in cyberspace is that, like Pigpen, we are shedding more and more little bits of clues about our identity wherever we go. As though that cloud of smog that surrounded him surrounds everyone when we go out to do stuff on the internet. And we can't help leaving clues about who we are. And in that smog, here you go, is this is there's redeeming social value here, I swear. When Anonymous hacked a bunch of law enforcement organizations to mock law enforcement, they posted this on their website. It says in leak speak, "You've been pwned by Wormer and cabin crew, love you bitches." It was just a piece of sort of counting coup. The picture, taken some years ago now, was taken with an iPhone. And Apple very nicely, just as a free feature, includes the geographic coordinates where a picture was taken in every picture you take with an iPhone. Turns out this was taken in a suburb of Melbourne in Australia. The FBI went there and, as they say in the report, made a positive ID of the subject. I've often wondered about that. Found that her boyfriend lived in Texas, and he is now serving a sentence for the exploit breaking into the law enforcement websites and exposing their data. He's married the subject. It's a basically happy ending all around. Basically, he's been betrayed by the smog of data that none of us can keep from shedding. More serious example, the Georgian government was dealing with Russian hackers who kept sending them malware to steal their data and taking control of their computers, viewing them as they were sitting at their desks, listening on their mics, recording their keystrokes, and taking data. They got sick of this. They took a piece of malware that one Russian hacker had sent them. They took that, they stuck it in a document that said super secret plan for attacking Russia. Not surprisingly, he took it, he opened it, this is his picture as he said, well, this isn't right, and reached for the plug. They have a picture of the hacker who was sending them stuff because they were able to turn the tables on him. And this is becoming a much more common phenomenon. It's very hard, it's increasingly hard for people who are doing this to hide. So this has led me to propose Baker's Law of cybersecurity. Our security sucks, but good news is so does theirs. And we can use the bad security that attackers have to identify them and bring consequences. So let me just talk a bit about how that might work. And there have been several reports that have focused on attackers and attributed attackers. This is a classic cyber espionage structure. What you see across the top is the Dalai Lama and all those other companies that have been compromised. Their compromised machines are reporting into a command and control machine, which often is the machine of some person who doesn't know that their machine has been taken over by the Chinese military and is being used for this purpose. They just don't have very good security on their machine, and it turned out to, and they have a fast internet connection, so the Chinese are using it. And then the PLA back in Shanghai or Beijing actually connects to that command and control server and steals the information, first pulls it down to the command and control server and then connects it back to Shanghai. Actually, let me go back here. The trick to attribution is to get into that command and control server. If you can do that, it turns out there's all kinds of files lying around that have been stolen from your company and everybody else. All of these guys have files sitting there. And often you'll see the Chinese, this is what Mandiant found, you'll see the Chinese log on to the command and control server from Shanghai. You'll be able to actually see what they're doing. And not surprisingly, sometimes they break off from stealing industrial secrets to send instant messages to their girlfriends or to update their Facebook account. And so you can start to really figure out exactly who these guys are, or at least who their girlfriends are. And that is the source of many of the reports that we've begun to see from Trend Micro, from Mandiant, that tell us a lot about the attackers and have attributed it quite clearly to the Chinese government. So what we haven't done yet, quite, but we're getting there, is attach some consequences to those attributions, to go from attribution to retribution. But I think we have to do that. You know, our DNA says we have to do that. And we are going to do that. And without much enthusiasm, without really wanting to have gotten into this, but kind of propelled by the publicity around some of these reports, the administration has begun to name and shame, in particular the Chinese, about its cyber espionage. And it's become a subject that even the president can talk about. 2 years ago, I think Jim said he was here to talk about the APT threat, and I've said about APT, that's what we used to call China before we called China China. At the beginning of this administration, people said, oh yes, there are attacks, you know, originating in Asia. But now they just say, yes, the Chinese government, they're breaking into your computer. That's a big step forward, and it's not something that the Chinese government is happy about. They're really very protective of their reputation, and they actually called some of these companies after the reports were ready to come out to say, you ever want to do business in China? Because you're screwing this up. So there has been an effort to hide many of these attributions. Hasn't worked, and now it will never work. But I think that's just the beginning. Naming and shaming depends on how willing to be shamed you are, and this has been too good a deal for China for them to stop just because of a little bit of naming and a little bit of shaming. I've proposed, and I've got an article in Foreign Policy up on their blog this week, a whole host of other things that we could do. We already have a set of sanctions for Belarusian kleptocrats and for people who deal in blood diamonds. We name them. We say this person deals in blood diamonds. This person is a kleptocrat in Belarus. No one in the United States may do business with them. We're going to seize their bank accounts wherever we find them. We're going to do everything we can to cut them out of the global economy. We have a set of sanctions like that on a number of Russians because of their bad human rights records. It seems to me that we ought to start protecting human rights right here in the United States by going after people who are breaking into computers here where we have their names, and their girlfriends' names and their instant messaging addresses, and begin to designate these people. They're all, I won't say kids, but they're all pretty young. Many of them are working for the PLA dirt cheap and without much enthusiasm as a long-term career. I guess it's their Edward Snowden's. And they all want to go into business. And if they want to go into business in the long run, they're going to want to sell stuff outside of China. And if they've been designated, it's going to be a little hard. So these are potentially real sanctions. We can do the same thing with visas. We can deny visas to companies, to colleges that train these guys that don't cooperate with our investigations, and the like. One of the good things about comprehensive immigration reform is that Senator Graham and Senator Whitehouse, after I testified, said they might try to stick some of these visa sanctions into the immigration bill, and sometime in the next 5 years we'll find it. And then finally, it seems to me, and then again for those of you who are victims of these attacks, the true golden fleece, the thing that we are dying to find, is not who's stealing the stuff, because the PLA is not, we're never likely to bring a lawsuit successfully against the PLA. But they're not stealing Exxon's bid information so that the PLA can work on it. They're stealing Exxon's bid information so that they can use that information to attack particular entities. So all of that, it seems to me, create opportunities for deterrence. Last point in this regard is, what's the role for private companies? I have focused a lot on the idea that you could do active defense, essentially using private sector resources to break into those systems, break into those command and control systems, because the private sector is going to have the greatest interest in gathering information about particular attackers and about the command and control data. And the FBI simply doesn't have the resources to look at that. They are going to treat your going to them and saying, you know, the Chinese broke into my system, and they're going to treat you just as though you had said to them, and they stole my bicycle too. They'll give you a little bit of free advice about the kind of lock you ought to use in the future, but they are not going to put a lot of effort into investigating the intrusion. There's just too many of them. And so one of the ideas that I have suggested we spend more time on is actually allowing, in certain circumstances, the private sector to spend money investigating attacks and gathering information about the attackers so that we can engage in retribution. I think that's important because and there are people who say, oh, gee, if we do that, you know, that poor guy whose computer was compromised is going to, you might see some of his private information in the course of looking for all of the attackers' information. And I understand that, but it seems to me that when you look at the greater social good, it's perfectly obvious that if you, let's suppose that you're RSA and you discover that somebody is in your system and is extracting information from it and pulling it down to the command and control server, you could just block any communications between the command and control server and your network. You just say, we won't accept anything from that command and control server, and you solved your problem. But you haven't solved the problem of all the other people who are daily sending information down to the command and control system. And it's, to my mind, being able to protect those folks from attack is far more valuable than the risk that there will be some compromise of information on the command and control server. Because all those other people that don't know they've been compromised, on average, 90 to 95% of them will never figure it out except when somebody calls them up and says, by the way, we figured out, we broke into the command and control server and found that you are being compromised. And it'll take them over a year to figure out that they have a compromise ongoing. So given that, it seems to me it's critical that we put as many resources into identifying the attackers and breaking into as many command and control servers as we can. Okay, last point, and then we can take some questions. How we can use attribution to help people, lawyers, CEOs, board of directors, to do an analysis of their cybersecurity measures without ever learning what MDM and SAML2O and DLP stand for. There's been way too much focus on the technology and not enough focus on the broad cybersecurity principles that need to be applied. And this is a new idea that I frankly am coming up with as we speak, so I'd be interested to hear from your views about how we can actually use this attribution and whether this system works. But what I'm proposing as a way of using attribution to determine how to measure the cost of particular security measures is to start with the person who's attacking us. Who are our attackers? Now that we know, we have lots of information that tell us This is what the Chinese look like when they attack us. This is what Anonymous looks like when they attack us. This is what crooks look like. And while it changes on a yearly basis, nonetheless, you can just look at an attack and begin to know who is coming after you. And the second question that you ask, and you'll see I'm going to go over both sides of this circle, what is it that they want? These guys, the attackers, all want different things. So, you know, if they're crooks, it's pretty easy. It's all about the Benjamins. They just want the money. And so now you can say, okay, so we have attackers and they want to steal money. If you're a bank, that's pretty much exactly what you're worried about. But suppose they're anonymous and they're trying to break into your system. What do they want? Well, it turns out they want the head of the CEO of HB Gary. They would like to embarrass particular companies that they have picked out for some evanescent political correctness reason. And so in the HB Gary case, they simply published a whole bunch of very embarrassing emails. And so you ask yourself, so that's the goal of Anonymous, is to find information that will cause embarrassment. And then the last, you know, what is the Chinese government, that's the, or other governments, it's not just the Chinese, what do they want? Well, for them, breaking into your system is often a 2-for-1 deal. One, you want to spy on people. You want to steal secrets from individual companies. And then you want to also be able to shift from spying to cyber war, to actually sabotaging systems so that you can say to the United States or whoever you're breaking into, don't mess with us or the power will go out tomorrow and it'll stay out for 3 weeks and you will be really sorry. That is the goal of cyber war planners, and they are enthusiastic about finding ways to break our systems, and it's not that hard, unfortunately. So you ask yourself, if I'm being attacked by people who are trying to actually break into systems on behalf of another government, what are the consequences of that? And that's, once you know their goals, you can say, what does it cost if they're in a position to turn out the power for 3 weeks? So what is it going to cost me as a power company if I suddenly discover that the power is being turned off by the North Koreans or the Iranians or the Chinese? What does it cost me to break into a system and to gather the intellectual property in a particular field? So that's the first set of questions. You begin by saying, who's likely to want to break in? What are they going to want to steal? And what will it cost me if they steal something? Now let's go back up to who is attacking me and ask the question, which is answerable from a lot of the reviews that have been done by security measures. What are the tactics that they're going to use? What tools are they going to use? Are they going to spearfish me? Are they going to use zero-day attacks? How are they going to try to break into my system? And once you've identified the tactics they use, which is you can get from a number of intelligence gathering companies, what are the countermeasures that you need to stop those particular kinds of attacks? And once you've come up with the countermeasures, and I put stands up there because a lot of people like their countermeasures, what do the countermeasures cost? So now you've started with who in each case, and you've walked around and you've come to a point where basically you're looking at the cost of the countermeasures that you need to stop these guys and the cost to you if you don't stop them. And that, it seems to me, without ever talking about the particular technology you're using, allows you to come up with an analysis of the cybersecurity measures you ought to be adopting and to vary that over time. So that's my proposal for a way to use attribution that will allow your CEO to say, all I need to know is which of these 3 attackers am I worried about and what do I have to do to stop them, and I will spend what it takes to stop them up to the point where it costs me more to stop them than the consequences of not stopping them. So that's my suggestion for a new way of thinking about cybersecurity budgeting. And that is the presentation. I'm happy to take questions. questions, I'm happy to talk about NSA if you want to talk about NSA, or I'd be glad to talk about cybersecurity.
Does your circular analysis here of how to educate a CEO also include a probability?
Yes, it has to. You're quite right. And I just didn't put a separate point on there, but on the left-hand side, if the attackers succeed, you have to say how likely is it the attackers will succeed. This is particularly tricky in the area of cyber war because there are no obvious, known, successful attacks on civilian infrastructure, and the administration is doing its best, I think totally unsuccessfully, to say, well, that's a violation of the law of war, you can't do that. I think that'll work about as well as other law of war doctrines. But that is, we're basically saying to the world, we are really scared about this, so please don't, if you want to attack us, don't do that. And I think that, that's exactly their reaction too. What that means is if we are attacked, I think it's highly likely that somebody like the Iranians or the North Koreans, who are not known for their restraint, would try that out. But if you're an executive, you say, well, maybe they'll try it out on, somebody at Bonneville and not me. So putting a number on that is pretty hard. DOD would say you have to assume it's 100% because if you can't stop it, it will happen. But for the other stuff, for anonymous or for the thieves, it's easier to come up with a calculation for the risk of that happening. I think you could get classified briefings on how likely it is that various actors would do this. The Chinese have never tried to break anything that they've broken into, or at least very rarely. The Iranians have been doing nothing but of late. They're trying to break our financial system. They've been looking for ways to break into our energy and pipeline and production systems. They've been doing it in a cautious way, sort of creeping up on it, saying, does this hurt? How about this? How about this? And eventually, it'll hurt us bad enough for us to do something about it. So again, it might only be a short outage, but I suspect we're going to see that from them. They're not bad. Yeah. A number of trade associations, or actually information sharing advisory committees associated in one way or another with the Department of Homeland Security, have begun working on how can we deal with this problem. And folks like the SANS Institute, the British government, the Australian government have come up with a list of security measures that, if adopted, are highly likely to defeat the attacks that are currently being used by, say, the Chinese government, although they call it APT, but they're talking about Chinese attacks. Now, those are slowly getting out of date as people adopt them. Then, one of them is that many of us have not adopted is whitelisting, where nothing runs on your computer but a program that has been pre-approved. That's what Bit9 does. And Bit9 signs every program and says, okay, only this program will run. Well, the Chinese, if they want you bad enough, they have gone to Bit9 and they've probably found ways to sign some of their malware so that it gets whitelisted. So there's nothing that is absolutely bound to work, and again, things tend to fall out of, become less effective over time. But industry, I think the short answer is industry has a set of ideas about how to deal with this, but you can't think of this as a one and done kind of thing. You do it, and you'll be painting the Golden Gate Bridge before you know it at the other end, because we've got a thinking adversary who has transformed its military and its economy by stealing stuff online. And they're not going to give it up easily. They're going to spend a lot of money to try to overcome our defenses. What we've begun to discover is they've so industrialized this process that they can plug anybody in. They've got excess capacity. They got guys who spend all day thinking of good ways to send spear phishing messages, other guys who develop zero-day attacks or change the malware so it can't be recognized by the antivirus software, and other guys who know enough English and know something about the industry to go in and steal this stuff. And for example, law firms, probably somewhere between 80 and 100 of the top of the AMLO 100 have been attacked, and probably successfully, by Chinese PLA attackers who are looking for information about mergers and acquisition negotiations with Chinese state-owned enterprises, or some other information, because there's a conflict and there's a Chinese company on one side of the conflict. They want to find out what the lawyers on the other side are saying, thinking, doing, planning. And so there have been a lot of attacks, and they basically just said, hey, how about law firms? And they plugged them in and found ways to get in. So lots of industries that don't ordinarily think of themselves as on the front lines are increasingly discovering intrusions of this kind. Yeah. Here's my sense. I think Treasury has your back on this. I think Treasury is going to say, you know, we've been worrying about this for a long time. Everybody agrees the financial industry has better cybersecurity than anybody else. Don't screw with that industry. Instead, use it as a model. And when I was in government, probably the most agitated and harsh call I got was from some deputy assistant secretary in the Treasury Department who called me up to say, you're going up to meet with Goldman Sachs in New York to find out about cybersecurity? How dare you? Those are our people. You don't talk to them. They talk to us. It was kind of amusing. But the determination to keep all of that inside Treasury's orbit is pretty substantial. And as you heard me, I hope you don't disagree with my analysis of Graham Leach Bliley. I think that system works for the financial industry, not because it's just because of the painting the bridge, but because there are inspectors who come along and ask people, what are you painting here? Why are you painting that way? What are you doing? And then they go to the next bank and they say, you know, the last bank I was at, they were painting under the bridge. Right? How come you're not painting under the bridge? And so there's this constant nudging forward, that you don't get without that kind of engagement from your regulators.
Center, I find out
you're Exxon and you discover that mobile is also being attacked. You say, hey, what do they got on mobile? What are they bidding?
I mean, is that a risk?
You know, it would be a little bit random if that happened, because there's lots of command and control servers. But it's not. I think you're right to raise that, and there has to be a certain amount of government oversight or regulation or principles that would apply. I mean, I would say, and to my mind, this will happen not by people just saying, oh, let's go right out on this and solve our problem on our own, but working with government. All that you really need from the government to be legal under the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act is for some intelligence or a law enforcement agency to say, you are using our authority when you do that. So it's like deputized. If you can be deputized, then you can do this and you're not going to be prosecuted. I would say that if you do get deputized, then a responsible law enforcement agency will say, now, one, you are not to cause any harm. You only get to gather information. Maybe you start with your own information, and the only thing you can do with that is either steal it back or encrypt it so it's no use to the thieves. Or you can gather information, but you have to tell everybody whose computer you discover has been compromised that they are compromised, but you're not allowed to look at the stuff that you find there. And I think, you know, there are probably 10 commandments that somebody who is engaged in this activity ought to observe. And since failure to observe that means you're outside of the authority that you've been given and suddenly you're subject to felony prosecution, I think there's a substantial incentive to stay within the lines. All right, well, thank you very much.